When did you catch the school principal laughing at something he shouldn't have? I'm sitting in the principal's office, ready to discuss the workplace harassment claim against me. It was from my teacher, Mrs. Callahan, who claimed my shoe squeaking was intrusive. She called it, and I quote, deliberate torture designed to undermine her authority. This all started 3 weeks ago when I finally saved enough from my part-time job to buy these limited edition $180 Nikes. When I walked into school, I felt like I was him. Sure, they squeaked a little on the hallway floors, but so what? Half the basketball team sounds like a squeaky toy convention when they walk to practice. But as soon as I walked into class, the vein on Mrs. Callahan's forehead looked like it was about to pop. The more I walked, the more it would swell up. I tried tiptoeing, but that only made the squeaking worse. By day 3, she was clutching her coffee mug so hard her knuckles went white. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Valentine's Day. My crush, the hottest girl in school, handed me a bag of candy hearts. Before I could even say thanks, Mrs. Callahan stormed over and snatched them out of my hands. First the squeaking, now this. Crinkling wrappers. Absolutely not. After that, my crush never spoke to me again. That hurt more than any detention. By the end of the week, she'd sent emails to the counselor and the vice principal about my disruptive footwear. That's when she crossed a line nobody saw coming. She got the school therapy dog banned. Sweet, gentle Bailey, who helped kids with anxiety. All because his collar jingled at the same frequency pattern as my shoes. For the entire week, you could feel the depression in the air. Even teachers were asking where their favorite golden Labrador was. The whole time, I kept it a secret from my mom because I knew she would freak out. But when she insisted on going to the parent-teacher conference, fear filled my body. On the day, Mrs. Callahan's face was covered in angry red acne that I'd never seen before. Sigh. Here we go. As soon as we sat down to talk to her, she went off. Your son has been threatening me in front of other students. My mom's eyes widened. Threatening you? What did he say? Mrs. Callahan leaned in dramatically. He pointed finger guns at me and said, catch you later, with 3 aggressive shoe squeaks. My mom walked out without another word, and within 24 hours, things went completely nuclear. Mrs. Callahan had scheduled a literal hearing for Friday morning, and she showed up with a rolling suitcase full of evidence. As for me, I just had myself and my angry Latina mom who took time off work to be there. Mrs. Callahan presented her case with a PowerPoint about sonic weapons in educational environments, but I had an ace up my sleeve. You see, I'd spent the previous night with my phone's decibel meter app documenting every sound in her classroom. So when it was my turn to present, I pulled out my phone and played the recordings. The pencil sharpener, 72 decibels. The ancient heating system, 68 decibels. Someone eating chips, 65 decibels. But the best part was the compilation video I'd made. 47 different classroom sounds, all louder than my squeaky shoes, including Mrs. Callahan's own heels click-clacking at 71 decibels and her aggressive stapler at 74 decibels. The principal leaned forward, watching her slam that stapler over and over in the video while my squeaks were barely audible in the background. The room went completely silent. Then the principal made the sound, somewhere between a snort and a laugh, and coffee came out his nose. He grabbed tissues while trying to compose himself, but his shoulders were shaking. My mom was biting her lip to keep from laughing. Even the union representative was covering her mouth. The principal finally cleared his throat, looked at Mrs. Callahan and said, I'm concerned that we're using district resources to prosecute. Squeaky shoes. He turned to me and added, though perhaps you could try walking heel to toe to minimize the sound. Then he looked back at Mrs. Callahan, who was turning purple, and said, I'll be reviewing the workplace harassment policy with all staff. Specifically, the part about what constitutes actual harassment versus minor annoyances we all deal with in a building full of teenagers. Case dismissed, or so I thought. Over the next month, I received rejection letters from all 5 colleges I'd applied to. Each one mentioned concerns raised about behavioral issues. My transcript was clean. I immediately knew Mrs. Callahan was behind it. And that's when my mom said 2 words that changed everything. Si acabó. It's over. My mom's phone was already in her hand before I could even process what she meant, her fingers flying across the screen as she scrolled through her contacts. She started talking rapid-fire Spanish to her cousin, who worked at some law firm downtown, pacing back and forth in our kitchen while gesturing with her free hand, like she always did when she was really mad. I caught words like discriminación and venganza between all the legal terms I didn't understand. Her face had that look I'd only seen twice before. Once when my older brother got suspended for something he didn't do, and once when our landlord tried to illegally raise our rent. Within an hour, she'd set up an appointment with someone named Veronica Vargas, who specialized in education law, and we were driving downtown in Mom's beat-up Honda with all 5 rejection letters in a folder on my lap. The next morning, we sat in Veronica's office while she spread out all 5 letters on her desk, her eyebrows raising higher with each one she read. She grabbed a yellow highlighter and started marking the same phrase on each letter about behavioral concerns, and showed us how they all used identical wording, which wasn't normal for college rejections. She explained that this suggested someone from my school had contacted all 5 colleges after I'd already applied, which violated something called FERPA laws about student privacy. She had us sign a bunch of forms to request information from both the school district and all 5 colleges, typing up formal letters on her computer while we waited. Monday morning, I walked into school wearing my squeaky Nikes and making sure every step was extra loud on purpose. Mrs. Callahan's face went from normal to purple in about 2 seconds when she saw me in the hallway, and she immediately started writing on her pink slip pad. She marched over to the vice principal's office with me following behind, but when she handed him the write-up for intentional disruption, he just looked at it, looked at her, then looked at me, and handed it back, unsigned. Other teachers were watching from their doorways, and I could see them whispering to each other as Mrs. Callahan stormed back to her classroom. 3 days later, the guidance counselor called me out of study hall and pulled me into her office, closing the door behind us and speaking in this weird whisper voice. She told me she'd been getting calls from colleges asking about my disciplinary record, which didn't make sense because I'd never been in serious trouble before. She looked really uncomfortable and kept fidgeting with her pen while explaining that Mrs. Callahan had filed some kind of official complaint that was now in my permanent file, and she had to send it when colleges called. I pulled out my phone and hit record without her noticing, asking her to repeat what she just said about Mrs. Callahan filing complaints after my applications were already submitted. Veronica filed the formal complaint with the district the next day, citing retaliation, defamation, and violation of my educational rights in this thick packet of legal documents. The district assigned someone named Alan Hopkins as an investigator, and his assistant started calling everyone involved to schedule interviews. Mrs. Callahan suddenly got sick and took 3 days days off in a row, leaving us with substitutes who had no idea what we were supposed to be learning. My mom went on our local community Facebook group that night and posted this vague question about whether other parents had experienced teacher retaliation without mentioning any names. Within 2 hours, the comments section exploded, with 17 different parents sharing stories about Mrs. Callahan going back 5 years. Screenshots started flooding in of emails she'd sent, complaints she'd filed, and one parent even had a recording of her saying she would make sure that kid never gets into a good school about their daughter who's now at community college. At lunch the next day, the basketball team guys came over to my table, which never happened before since I wasn't exactly part of their crowd. They said they'd testify about their squeaky shoes never being a problem in any other class, and one of them pulled out his phone to show me a video he'd recorded. It was Mrs. Callahan in the teacher's lounge right after the hearing, saying she had it out for me and was going to teach me a lesson about respect. They were all still pissed about Bailey being banned and wanted to help however they could. Alan Hopkins interviewed me for 2 hours in the conference room, taking notes on his laptop about everything from the Valentine's candy incident to the therapy dog situation. He kept asking me to repeat certain parts and seemed really interested in the timeline of when things happened, especially the therapy dog ban and my college rejections. He asked for my decibel meter data from the hearing and made copies of all my recordings, then mentioned this wasn't his first investigation involving Mrs. Callahan, but he couldn't say more about that. Word spread around school that there was an official investigation happening, and suddenly Mrs. Callahan came back acting like the nicest teacher ever. She brought donuts for the teacher's lounge, smiled at everyone in the hallways, and even tried to make small talk with students, but everyone could tell it was fake. Why does Mrs. Callahan care so much about squeaky shoes when the whole school is basically a noise factory? I'm curious what made her pick this particular kid to go after when basketball players squeak around all day. Other teachers were keeping their distance from her, and the substitute who covered her classes mentioned to us that she'd left 0 lesson plans for 3 days, which was against school policy. Veronica called us a week later saying she'd gotten responses from 3 of the colleges, confirming they'd received negative information about me after my applications were already submitted and under review. One admissions officer named Tamara Barrett from State was willing to provide a written statement about how unusual it was to get post-application calls about a student and how the information provided didn't match the student profile they'd reviewed. This was exactly what we needed to prove Mrs. Callahan had deliberately sabotaged my college applications after I'd already applied. The next morning, the principal's secretary called and said he wanted to see me right away. I grabbed my backpack and headed down the empty hallway to his office. He was sitting behind his desk looking tired and kept rubbing his temples like he had a headache. He closed the door and sat back down with this heavy sigh. He started talking about how Mrs. Callahan had been teaching for 15 years and how she was going through a really rough divorce. His voice got quieter when he said, maybe we could work something out without all the lawyers and paperwork. He kept saying things like, she didn't mean any harm and everyone makes mistakes when they're stressed. I told him I couldn't drop the complaint after what she did to my college applications. His shoulders dropped and he just nodded like he already knew what I was going to say. When I got home, my mom was on her laptop at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. She looked up with this huge smile and showed me her screen. She'd found out Mrs. Callahan had been using her school email account to contact the colleges about me. Every email she sent left a digital trail in the school's system that they couldn't delete. Veronica called within minutes and told us to demand the district preserve all electronic communications immediately. My mom typed up the request, while Veronica was still on speaker explaining what words to use. The IT department got involved that same afternoon and started pulling records from the servers. By the end of the day, Mrs. Callahan was placed on administrative leave while they investigated everything. The next morning at the school, everyone was talking about Bailey being gone and how unfair it was. This girl from my English class started a petition during lunch to bring him back. She set up a table near the cafeteria with a big poster of Bailey's picture and markers for people to sign. Within an hour, she had over 200 signatures, and kids were lining up between classes. By the second day, the petition had 800 names, including some teachers who signed when nobody was looking. The local news station showed up after school and interviewed students about the therapy dog ban. They didn't mention the investigation, but everyone knew something bigger was happening. Parents started posting on the school's Facebook page demanding answers about why Bailey was banned. The school board's email inbox was getting flooded with complaints from angry parents. Alan called Veronica 3 days later with something huge he'd discovered. He'd been going through my academic records and found Mrs. Callahan had changed my grades twice after the hearing. She dropped my A- in her class to a B+ and changed my participation grade from excellent to satisfactory. The changes were just enough to drop my GPA below the cutoff for automatic scholarship eligibility at State. He kept digging and found 3 other students over the past 5 years who'd complained about her. Every single one had grade changes right after they filed complaints with similar drops that affected their academic standing. The pattern was so clear that even the district couldn't ignore it anymore. Alan said he was adding all of this to his report for the state investigation. 2 days later, Valerie Holland called Veronica trying to work out a deal. She was the union representative and had to defend Mrs. Callahan, even though she didn't sound happy about it. Veronica put her on speaker so my mom and I could hear everything. Valerie admitted that Mrs. Callahan had been a problem for years, but the union had to protect her rights. She offered to have Mrs. Callahan write apology letters to me and the colleges if we dropped the investigation. She even said Mrs. Callahan would transfer to a different school next year. Veronica told her we needed time to think about it, but I already knew the answer. We refused the settlement offer the next morning, and Veronica filed additional complaints with the state education department. She also contacted the teacher licensing board about Mrs. Callahan's behavior and the grade changes Alan had found. The stakes got way higher than anyone expected when the licensing board opened their own investigation. Mrs. Callahan's teaching license was now under review, which meant she might never teach again anywhere in the state. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting after getting hundreds of emails from parents. They put me on the agenda to speak publicly about everything that had happened. The meeting was in the high school auditorium because they expected a big crowd. When we arrived, the parking lot was already full and people were walking in from the street. The auditorium was packed with angry parents and students holding signs about bringing Bailey back. Mrs. Callahan sat in the back row with a man in a suit who must have been her lawyer. She was taking notes on a yellow legal pad and wouldn't look at anyone. When they called my name, I walked up to the microphone with my phone in my hand. I started by explaining about the shoes and the harassment claim she filed against me. Then I played the recording I had of the counselor admitting she was pressured to send negative information to colleges. is. The whole room went silent, except for the counselor's voice coming through the speakers. The board members started looking at each other with worried faces, and the district's lawyer leaned over to whisper frantically to the superintendent. When the recording ended, several parents stood up shouting that Mrs. Callahan should be fired immediately. The board president had to bang his gavel to get everyone to quiet down. Mrs. Callahan suddenly stood up and demanded to speak, even though she wasn't on the agenda. She walked to the microphone with tears already running down her face. She started talking about her stress and sound sensitivity issues that made teaching difficult. She claimed I deliberately tortured her with my squeaky shoes, knowing it would trigger her condition. She said she was just trying to protect the learning environment for all students. Nobody in the audience looked convinced, and one board member actually rolled his eyes while she was talking. When she finished, the board went into a quick recess to discuss everything. They came back 15 minutes later, and the president announced their decisions. The board voted unanimously to reverse Bailey's ban effective immediately, and he would be back at the school tomorrow. They also ordered a full review of Mrs. Callahan's conduct, including all the grade changes Alan had found. The counselor was directed to send corrected information to all 5 colleges, explaining the error and confirming my actual academic record. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, while Mrs. Callahan grabbed her bag and stormed out with her lawyer following behind. The next morning, my phone started buzzing like crazy with emails from colleges. 2 of them had already moved me from rejected to waitlist status after getting the corrected info from our counselor. My hands were shaking as I opened the 3rd email from State University. The admissions lady, Tamara Barrett, had actually called my house phone and left a message saying they were looking at my application again with fresh eyes. Mom was already on the phone with Veronica telling her about all the emails coming in. I could hear Veronica's voice through the speaker saying something about momentum and keeping pressure on the district. That same afternoon, Alan showed up at our house with a thick folder of papers. He spread them out on our dining room table and started pointing at different documents. There were emails between Mrs. Callahan and the colleges with timestamps showing she'd contacted them right after our first hearing. She'd attached fake disciplinary reports that never existed in my actual school record. Alan had also found grade changes in the system, where she'd lowered my scores in other teachers' classes without their knowledge. One teacher had even filed a complaint when she noticed her gradebook had been changed. The investigation report recommended termination and said the district needed to decide whether to fight the recommendation or settle with us. Mom's eyes got wider with each page Alan showed us. 3 days later, we got a call from someone we never expected. Mrs. Callahan's ex-husband had tracked down my mom's number and wanted to meet at a coffee shop downtown. He brought a folder of his own with court documents from their divorce. He showed us texts and emails where Mrs. Callahan had been acting weird for months before our problems even started. She'd been calling him at all hours, claiming neighbors were making noise to harass her. He tried to get her help, but she refused to see anyone. He looked really tired and said he'd been worried about her being around kids, but didn't know who to tell. Mom thanked him for coming forward, but we both knew we had to stay focused on getting justice. The district's lawyers called Veronica the next week with a settlement offer. They wanted to pay back all my college application fees and write official letters to every school I'd applied to. Talk about digital karma. Mrs. Callahan used school email to trash a student and basically signed her own pink slip with every click of the send button. Pretty sure leave a paper trail of your revenge plot wasn't. They also offered to pay for a college consultant to help me with late applications. The settlement included a public apology from the district and new rules about teachers contacting colleges about students. Mrs. Callahan would be moved to a job with no student contact. Veronica called it a solid offer, but said we should push for more. We met with the district people in a conference room at their main office building. Mom insisted Mrs. Callahan couldn't have any access to student records or recommendations ever again. The district superintendent nodded and agreed to add that to the settlement. They also threw in payment for SAT prep courses and guaranteed positive recommendation letters from the principal and counselor. Veronica leaned over and whispered that this was a complete victory. We signed the papers right there. The best day came when Bailey returned to the school. Students had made signs and banners saying, "Welcome back, Bailey," and hung them all over the main entrance. When the therapy dog walked through the front doors with his handler, the whole hallway erupted in cheers. Kids were crying and hugging him while teachers stood in their doorways smiling. I noticed something funny though. At least 5 teachers were wearing brand new sneakers that squeaked loudly on the floor. They walked past the principal's office making as much noise as possible. The principal just stood there with his coffee pretending not to notice all the squeaking. Even the janitor had gotten new boots that made noise. 2 weeks later, I got the email I'd been waiting for. State University had accepted me for fall admission with a partial scholarship. Tamara Barrett had added a personal note at the bottom. She said she was impressed by how I'd handled everything and looked forward to having me on campus. Within the next few days, 3 more colleges reversed their rejections. One even offered me a spot in their honors program. Mom cried when she read that one. We went out for tacos to celebrate, and she kept showing the acceptance letters to random people at the restaurant. About a month later, one of my friends spotted Mrs. Callahan at the district office building. She was working in a back room doing data entry with no windows. My friend's mom worked there and said Mrs. Callahan ate lunch alone every day at her desk. She'd apparently tried to file for disability, claiming she had a sensitivity to sounds. The disability office rejected her claim. Some teachers from other schools started sharing their own stories about her online. One said she'd tried to get a kid expelled for clicking his pen too much. Another said she'd written up a girl for wearing jewelry that jingled. Then everything really blew up when the local news got hold of Alan's investigation report. They'd used some Freedom of Information law to get all the documents. The story ran on the evening news with Mrs. Callahan's picture right there on the screen. The reporter talked about abuse of power and showed screenshots of her fake disciplinary reports. Parents started commenting on the news station's social media with their own horror stories. One mom said Mrs. Callahan had tried to get her daughter kicked off the honor roll for humming. Another parent said she threatened their son for tapping his foot during a test. Her name was trending on local social media for 3 days straight. People were sharing memes about squeaky shoes and making jokes about her sound sensitivity. The district sent out an email to all parents saying they were reviewing their policies. A few weeks later, I got invited to speak at a district workshop about student rights. They wanted me to talk about standing up to authority abuse and the importance of keeping records. Mom sat in the front row, recording everything on her phone. I showed them screenshots of all my documentation and explained how recording those classroom sounds had saved me. After I finished, at least 10 students came up to me with their own stories about unfair treatment. One girl said her teacher had been changing her grades too. Another kid said his